I'm Jeremy Knoll with B&IM Architects and also one of the co-founders of Historic Green, which you'll hear about in a little bit here. If you're at a table with 3 or less people, could you maybe find another table with 3 or less people and move there? We'd like to get as much conversation as we can going here in our workshops. And let's go ahead and get started here. Inspiration is an elusive feeling sought in these conferences, I know for me. It's hard to hold on to in the day-to-day tedium of sort of getting the work done, right? And inspiration can charge you up for the impossible task, for the thing that is just out of reach. And the thing about inspiration is that in being inspired, you inspire other people, that by doing the good work, other people see you doing that and want to help. We're going to need a lot of this essential ingredient of life to face the challenges ahead of us as a species. And the panel before you here includes 4 of the most inspiring people I know, include 2 Hanley Award winners as of last night, Bob Berkebile and Tom Darden. In 2005, at Greenbuild in Atlanta, Georgia, there was a conversation around what the future of New Orleans could be, should be. And this included hundreds of participants, both Greenbuild members, but also residents and representatives from New Orleans. And through that conversation, a new future was put together in the development of the New Orleans Principles, a new future representing a new vision for what could be. Bob Berkebile and Charles Allen are going to start us off this morning talking about what it was like to be the first responders in this effort to repair this city. And what does one of you have the clicker? Can I see that? Thank you. Are we ready? And then we will after. Okay. And after we hear from what happened, how these New Orleans Principles were put together, we're going to talk as in our groups about where the New Orleans Principles are now, what we've learned, what's coming in the future, what makes sense for the next decade of efforts. And then Ryan Evans and Tom Darden, to me, represent those who were inspired to action by the vision created through people like Bob Berkebile and Charles Allen. And they're going to talk about the organizations and the work that they went through to create a response and an action to follow the principles and what that's meant to them and how that has now grown into other communities. So I want to take up as little time as I can of their time here, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it right over to Bob to get us started.
Thanks, Jeremy, and good afternoon, everyone. I think it's important to start with something really important, and that is literally when the day after Katrina, when the sun came up, members of USGBC started calling Washington, D.C., saying, what can we do? We want to help. How can we help? And in a very short period of time, just before Greenbuild, 4 national design charrette teams were created, expert teams. I was asked to facilitate those teams, and so I in turn asked for at least 50 people from New Orleans to come to Atlanta and join these charrette teams to begin thinking about how would this community build back after such a disaster. What surfaced from that were what became known as the New Orleans Principles. There were actually 4 separate reports. One was a set of principles for the Gulf Coast, one for schools, and one for housing. And frankly, so folks were coming to Greenbuild, but instead of going to all the workshops like we normally do, everyone was sequestered in rooms like this, trying to sort out what the hell happened and how do we move forward with some kind of intelligence and integrity, and could this be an opportunity for transforming this community to make it truly something that had never been envisioned before. We were fortunate that as everyone was working, Alex Wilson happened to be there, who we were already relying on as a great resource for materials and science, but he made more sense, I always felt, in recording what we did than what we were doing at the time, so I want to acknowledge that at this point. I think these principles is important that, at least for me, they represented a totally new way of thinking. So as a community of New Orleans and as a group of national participants, we were trying to look more holistically at this as a larger system connected to all of the systems around it, social, environmental, and economic, to see what might be possible if we accept that addressing this in that way, we could get something totally new. And one of the things that I think surfaced from that and some other related work that was going on at the same time is one of the greatest opportunities is to look at the relationships between natural systems and human systems. And when we really start understanding those relationships and choose to touch their intersections, what we find is we can get transformative change of collected systems. And so there was a lot of energy invested in that way, looking at these principles. I'm not going to go through them all now. They're at your table. I think you're going to have a chance to talk about them later. But I just want to touch on one. I think they're all equally important, if you will. But number 8, which we at the time called passive, or provide for passive survivability. So if something like this should happen again, how would the individual residents and the community be more resilient against that storm, and how would people to continue to live healthy immediately after, even without outside support? This particular principle has evolved since then to become not passive survivability anymore, but resilience. And Alex, among others, Alex has gone on to create a Resilient Design Institute, and many of you know, there are now resilience officers in a number of cities, and I think more coming. So it has created a whole new language and a whole new approach. And you could say the same about each other principle, but for the moment we'll just continue with that one. I thought my job was to facilitate those charrettes, and then someone from USGBC would come and present them. But during the charrettes, it was determined that I would deliver them to New Orleans even before Greenville was over, because the governor had assembled a summit of 500 people who were making decisions about infrastructure and how to react to FEMA and relate to FEMA, et cetera. So I came with John Williams as my guide, who was a local architect, and he showed me into the lower Ninth Ward when the water was there and the National Guard was there, and it began changing my life as I met Pam DeShiel, and then Charles Allen and many other friends who were here trying to make sense of this phenomenal event. Out of that came a number of planning initiatives. This particular one in this image was managed by some of the folks that were in that charrette at Greenville. And it included Bill Becker, Bill Browning, and myself, Bob Berkebile. I always referred to as the B team. And I promised that we would stay long enough to help them find the A team. And we're still looking for that A team. And so maybe some of you and the A team are present today. Out of that came a number of initiatives, one of which was Global Green, which is Gorbachev's U.S. organization, at the time directed by Matt Peterson, wanted to do something here, and I was recruited to help them, and a decision was made to create an international design competition to get the best minds on the planet thinking about how would one create a model for new living in a place like New Orleans, in particular the lower Ninth Ward. And Brad Pitt became, if you will, the celebrity member of that jury. And he was very taken with these green principles, and especially taken with New Orleans and the people in New Orleans. And his feeling was that what had happened in the Global Green Charrette and what has now been partially built and is still being implemented was brilliant, but the people in New Orleans deserved a lot more. And so he launched Make It Right, and you're going to hear more about that from Tom, so I think I'll leave it at that. But it was a really important moment when a national celebrity really made a commitment in New Orleans. These are the first houses that were part of the Global Green development, and as I said, more is still underway there. So this was a bold statement by Brad and Tom and their colleagues to say, people care about this city and we're going to do something really extraordinary. I want to share a couple more of experiences because I think they inform the conversation we're about to have. So another disaster was an F5 tornado that visited the little town of Greensburg, Kansas. And it essentially, as you can see, removed this town but for a grain elevator. And we learned, we should have known already, attached concrete cylinders are really strong structure. I'm standing in Main Street looking north to the grain elevator to give you a sense of what this community looked like the day after. We had, prior to that time, worked with a number of communities like New Orleans in a post-disaster environment, and we had developed a technique of engaging the community in a dialogue. And we always looked for the largest gymnasium or something to house everyone, and Greensburg didn't have an auditorium. They didn't have anything but a grain elevator. So FEMA helped us by creating these circus tents, and we invited everyone to come back to town on weekends for meals, to see one another again after the storm, to celebrate the lives that were lost and begin a conversation about their future. And because of that, for the first time in my experience of about, at that point, I think 9 communities, we had all the women and children present. And what I discovered in Greensburg was by having them all in the conversation, it changed the questions, it changed the conversation, and it changed the outcome entirely. So now that's a requirement. If we're working in a community, we expect all hands to be participating. So Meg Wheatley talked about this. She said there is no power as strong as a community that decided what it really cares about. And part of what I hope we can talk about today is what do you care about now, and how would that inform our collective strategies moving forward? So Greensburg has been recognized by 2 presidents, Bush and Obama, by the Urban Land Institute and by Financial Times for their efforts, but it really was born in that dialogue. And we're starting more and more to address what I call the larger disaster, not natural disaster, which I would argue, even in New Orleans, that was not a natural disaster. Katrina certainly was, but the damage was a man-made disaster. It was ignoring 2 environmental studies that said don't build the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. If you do, you'll put downtown New Orleans at risk. And those reports were thrown out. They built it anyway, and it allowed the storm surge. Everyone went to bed that night thinking, thank God we dodged a bullet. And during the night, the water came up. Mr. Go overturned those levees, and 20 feet of water moved through the lower Ninth Ward. We created that. And in all of our communities, we're creating similar disasters by unintentional acts and old thinking and using obsolete doctrine. So we're beginning to try to address these principles in communities to see what resilience can look like if we don't wait for the natural disaster. If we recognize we're creating it now, what are the strategies? This happens to be in Kansas City, Missouri. It's a neighborhood called Manheim Park. In the center of Manheim Park is a school that's been dark for 20 years. We were asked by our congressman to work in this neighborhood as volunteers to help them create a new vision for themselves. And the congressman and I and our colleagues from Kansas City refer to this as the Green Impact Zone, but our newspaper, the Kansas City Star, refers to it as a killing zip code for a reason. You'll notice when you see this that there's a line roughly down the left third of this large plan on the right, and that's called Troost Avenue. To the left of that line, the houses look dense and normal. To the right of that line, you'll notice that half of the homes are missing. That's a result of unintended consequences from block busting that took place following the Second World War that triggered a destructive process that's present almost in every community in America. And so today we have the killing zip code. And as we work with that neighborhood, they said the one thing that would make the biggest difference would be if we could acquire that school and transform it to some useful purpose. They thought that would give them more hope and more opportunity going forward. And I should mention, I mentioned Tom earlier, but Tim Dugan, who used to be with BNIM, is now with Make It Right, was central to that conversation and is actually a nearby neighbor part of the time. So when you look at, there are lots of charts I could show you, but if you look at the demographics where it turns from dark green to light green, which is about income, you can see that Troost Avenue is the dividing line. And if you look at every other aspect of the demographics, you'll find the same pattern. So that turned out to be, well, here's another one in terms of race. It's stunning. And you can find these same patterns in your community wherever that is, I guarantee you. This just happened to be the one we were dealing with. So we were fortunate to be able to have partners like Make It Right and to find a developer who's willing to take the risk, and a number of other institutions in our community that would band together to repurpose that school and to add new housing on site, all designed to LEED Platinum and supported by Make It Right's philanthropy and some of the solar technology they've developed and their product lines and so on. So it gives you an idea what the school looked like before in one of the apartments that was in that same classroom today. Really terrible housing. You know, we could probably get about 4 times the rent for this were it not in a low-income, fairly assisted program. But it's the way it is. So this is an image, I think, if I can get this started. Yeah. So Jeremy Knoll was the project manager, and he stood on the street corner about once a month, was it? Every few weeks taking these pictures so you can kind of see it evolve. But I think as it's proceeding, is it proceeding or is it not? Technology failure. But what's important to know is that now, 1 year, a little more than a year after it was finished, 18 men in this community that didn't have an education, didn't have jobs, were trained and helped build the project. And today, 12 of them have full-time employment, and all of them are still employed. Just 6 are still looking for full-time work. Also, this community is healthier. They have much more confidence. They have now a community center in this building. They have a computer lab coming to this building, and it's starting to build human capacity in the middle of this really critical zone. So we're currently launching phase 2 of that project, which is now about restoring some of those houses that were empty and now could be acquired, and with friendly money and help could be upgraded to high-quality, healthy homes, and then inserting new homes, not unlike Make It Right here. And so Tim and Make It Right have been organizing 6 different firms to design homes like happened in New Orleans that will be located throughout this neighborhood. And then we expect that private development will enter this picture and continue the same work. The same idea we're using, I'm calling this, by the way, urban acupuncture. So that's a strategic investment of leadership, design, and capital at an important place, at an important time, to stimulate catalytic positive change. And we know now that is possible based on Bancroft. It's certainly for the neighborhood. We haven't proven yet that it's also profitable for the developer or the architect. We lost money. The developer didn't make money. That's not a good pattern. And so we hope in this project to prove that that also can be changed and that this is more successful from all parties. So these are two schools across the street from one another that have been empty for a number of years, and we are trying to buy them and repurpose them, one as a center for community vitality and the other as a center for innovation and education and creativity. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'll just show you some of the things that are taking place in those facilities. I'll just mention one because it's kind of symbolic of the others. On the lower right, you'll see a really good-looking car and 4 kids, all of whom lived in that Killing zip code. These were kids in our high school of last resort, and this is an after-school program called Mind Drive. And these young people, there was actually 8 more in addition to these 4, designed and built this electric car. And we went to Bridgestone to get tires for it because they make a low-friction tire, and they agreed to give us tires, and they came with the tires and saw this car and our students, and they said, we'd like to take this to our test track in Texas with the students and test it, which they did. And when they did, we discovered, and the world discovered, that this car broke all the records on the planet for efficiency. So the $10 million X-Prize car got about 135 miles to the gallon. This car gets 444. This year, we just had a board retreat, and we voted to increase the number of students from about 30 to 100 this year. And these students are now getting, they never graduated from high school previously. Now they are getting college scholarships, et cetera. So other things that are happening in that kind of community are all these functions. It's sort of a boot camp for 21st century living that will infect the rest of the community and transform, we hope, our part of the city forever. These are the synergies that are new because those institutions will be in this facility. This is the same thing happening at Pine Ridge, the Native American reservation, the folks that killed Custer and have been punished every day since. So I just want to close before I pass it to Charles by saying, I was thinking of this last night. All of you and this organization has basically transformed the design and construction industry in a relatively short period of time. But in spite of all your best efforts, we still have these things happening. And if you look at all the projections, the future is not very bright for the people we intend to serve. And so my question for you in the conversations is, how do we take what we've learned and instead of trying to change the design and construction industry, how about changing us and our culture to be sure that this young lady who lives at Pine Ridge is pretty happy about what she sees in the year Perfect Vision 2020. Charles.
Thank you, my friend. Let's see. So, as Bob mentioned, our dear friend and mentor, Pam DeShield, some of you in this room I know recall her. She at the time recruited me and many others to get involved in this critical planning process, and what was a lot of times a very daunting task of trying to focus on and actually do the work of trying to rebuild our community. And I was one of those, like a lot of folks, just concerned with my own personal issues, okay? But Pam was always looking outward and always thinking of community. She was always thinking more of, herself and about 5 other folks. And so when she heard I was back into the city, which was around maybe the second weekend of 2005 in October, so that's about 5 to 7 weeks after Katrina, she's calling me on my cell phone, asking me, where are you? Where the hell are you? And I said, Pam, I'm downtown on Gravier Street living with my boss, John McLaughlin, in his high-rise condo. Okay, what do you need, girl? And she's like, look, I'm hearing this, I'm hearing that, We got to get some things going, and we got to find as many of our people as possible. And as you will recall back then, our people from all over the city, we were just cast and scattered all around the country and in some respects around the world. And so bit by bit, day by day, week by week, we worked aggressively to try to reconnect with people. We came across a resident by the name of Warnetta Banks from Lower 9. She was living in Houston, Texas. And I remember watching her email threads that she was engaged in these conversations with people, and there were people from Lower 9, and they were all over. I mean, she had this long-ass distribution list of email addresses. And so I remember I called Pam and I said, Pam, who is this Warnetta chick? She's got the pulse of everybody here. We need her help, okay? So we recruited Warnetta, and gradually we just worked to sort of reconstitute a network of our community. And in the coming months, remainder of the year, 2005 on into 2006, we began to just have, once again, our Holy Cross Neighborhood Association meetings. And Holy Cross is this community, this sliver along the river, as we call it, of the Lower Ninth Ward. And so our role, again, was to try to find as many people as possible, to try to begin facilitating an overall dialogue around neighborhood recovery and bringing together resources in terms of humans, material, financial, informational, you name it, so we could begin to help our people make some very critical decisions. And then also, as I found a lot of times in my role back then, and maybe we still do to some degree, serving as this gatekeeper between the authorities and the people on the ground, begin to try to build trust between the people on the ground and the authorities. And I'm sure you all, in your own respective roles, you find yourselves playing that role of gatekeeper, playing that role of helping to build trust between people. And again, overall, beginning to try to shape, as we reconstitute our network of folks, what is going to be the future of our community? What are we going to look like? Just everything. How are we going to rebuild schools, churches, you name it. I mean, as you all recall in the news back then, every aspect of life down here was flooded, was shattered, every aspect. But more and more as we connected with people, people beyond a shadow of a doubt said, I'm focused on coming back home. I'm focused on rebuilding. And people, I think, we realized, I don't think people told me this, they realized if we do this, we've got to do it better. We've got to be smarter in about how we rebuild this community. And we recognize, especially the older folks, and some are younger ones, but the older folks recognize there are going to be future storms. There are going to be future disasters. It's all about how we be and how we become more passively survivable. And as we've come to know it more and more resilient going forward. And so this is an image that just shows us very engaged in one of our planning conversations, led by this fine brother here, Bob Berkebaugh and John Williams and others. And you'll see there in this image some of the premier leaders and friends from our Lower Nine community. I remember this particular conversation here. It was around what side or what area of the neighborhood do we focus on first? And that group of folks, that basically represents a cross-section of folks who were from across the neighborhood. So you can imagine how tense that discussion was, okay? You got one sister there, Daphne, who was like, oh no, we will focus on my street, okay? And someone else is like, but I'm way on the other side in Holy Cross, what about us? And in these conversations, they were tough ones, issues of class and money and race, okay, to some degree. A majority black population, black community, but we have had, like a lot of communities across America, issues of race and racism that have divided us over time, So, for the most part, I think we decided we got to focus on this neighborhood. We recognize that not everybody is going to come back in droves at the same rate, okay? So we will do our best with as many of our people as possible. And again, the focus is, how do we do it in terms of learning lessons for tomorrow? And so the cover there, that document, that represents the planning document of a subsequent planning process we went through called the Unified New Orleans process. Unified New Orleans planning process, excuse me. But that cover there, and it was alluded to early in Bob's talk, this is the foundation for how we've been focused on recovery in Lower Nine along energy-efficient, sustainable lines. And the planners of that UNOP process, when they got hold of that planning, the planning document focused on energy-efficient, sustainable restoration, they said, can we borrow from this liberally? I said, absolutely, okay? And over time, we have to ensure that we get as much buy-in to this new vision as possible. Now, why I say over time? Because in this conversation here, we were probably no more than about 50 to 75 folks from Lower Nine back in the neighborhood, and this was late fall, early winter 2006, from a pre-Katrina population of a little over 14,000. So over time, we recognize over time, more and more of our people will come back. And they've got to learn about these various ideas and conversations that we've been having. And so it was ongoing, to say the very least. One of the other thoughts that came out of our planning conversations is we need some sort of on-the-ground, community-based entity to further help drive home this focus of an energy-efficient, sustainable recovery. So we created a nonprofit known as the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement Development. That's a long name, forgive me. That was from my academic years. You know, how we are in academia, we love long titles describing something. But at the end of the day, it was a vehicle to, again, further engage people on this planning and recovery vision that we've been kicking around. And then also, again, helping get to people information from the various authorities, so from the Corps of Engineers to FEMA to local government. And then also help residents begin to know some newfound friends in this overall work. Bob Berkebaugh and Tom Darden, Jeremy and Ryan, and I see another friend who came in, Beth Galante, and you name it. It was through our community meetings, our neighborhood association meetings, that we began to share information with folks and get additional ideas for how we reconstitute and recover this community. And more, the word was getting out around the city as to what we were doing in Lower Nine. And, you know, we weren't selfish. We shared our knowledge and love with other neighborhoods because the attitude is we're in this together, okay? New Orleans is coming back. And so this center employs, of course, mainly local folks from Lower Nine. That's a heavy focus. If we're going to be about workforce development, we've got to focus on home first. And we continue to work closely with local, state, federal government, as well as the other myriad of multi-sector partners that we've amassed through the years. And I highlight these images here. These are images of the Make It Right project as it began to unfold. But I want to go back to the Global Green Project because it was in late 2005, early 2006. Pam and I and others from our neighborhood association, again, we met Brad Pitt, other folks from Global Green, Beth Galante, because Brad admitted to us he heard about our planning process that we went through and the conversations that we've been having around being more energy efficient and sustainable. And he came to us and said, look, I want to help that. I really do. I want to help that as much as I possibly can. So we started with the Global Green Project, which is continuing. And then eventually we met folks from Cherokee Investment, Tom Darden, his father, and many others, and began to shape up, with many other community partners from Lower Nine, began to shape up and further advance the Make It Right project. And it has unfolded. Here's an image of a resident, of course, happy as hell to have her beautiful, elevated, resilient home. Here are images of our children. This is a playground in the neighborhood where the equipment is solar powered. And so I throw up this image because we recognize that we have to, as much as possible, impart this kind of knowledge and sensibility on our children because they will be here longer than we will. They will, of course, endure and deal with any other disasters that come our way. And so they've got to believe in and be equipped and be resilient for us all. And this is just an image of just a few of the many, many faces of our people from Holy Cross and Lower Nine whom we've been involved with in terms of helping to chart this path towards a more resilient Lower Nine and City of New Orleans. You know, it goes without saying that it takes a village, and every step of the way, it has truly been a village. Not saying that we've all agreed on how we go about doing it, okay? We're at times like a bunch of conservatives and liberals, okay, Republicans and Democrats. But at the end of the day, we recognize what are the common threads that bind us? Truly, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a better future, a more resilient future, as we realize those goals. And then I throw up here the image of Pam, because again, she was that visionary leader. She was that longtime activist and friend and mentor and great recruiter of talent and people. Folks, if she heard or recognized that you had a skill set that she thought she could utilize, you were going to get an email or a phone call, maybe even a late night visit or early morning visit The point was, she was great at working in groups and identifying who and what it takes to move a rock up a hill. And so we dedicate this work to her as well, and so many others that we have lost in the nearly 10 years since Katrina. And so we climb and we continue on, and we believe we are truly headed towards a more resilient future. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I think that's a really fitting tribute to Pam Dashiell, who I know for me was really my inspiration for beginning the work that I've continued to do in New Orleans, and with her passing has been such a source of inspiration and energy to, I think, everybody up here and many others in the room. So we're going to dive into our workshop here, and there are a couple of ways, a couple of things that are going to happen. So number one, does everybody have one of these? Probably, yeah. Heather, can you pull up the URL? So today we have launched a MindMixer website that includes ways to continue this conversation beyond this room. We have limited time today, and we won't be able to hear from everybody. But this is a way, all of the questions that we're going to go through are up here. It takes about 3 seconds to log in, and then you can answer the questions as you go along here, or using the butcher paper in front of you. There are copies of the New Orleans Principles at every table. If you want your own copy, there are many at the other tables here. So feel free to grab those. So the first exercise that I'd like to go through, you're going to work individually for this one. We're going to spend about 5 minutes focused on this first piece. So here's the URL, and you have to type in the HTTP piece of that. And it's NOLA Principles, N-O-L-A, Principles, L-E-S, .mindmixer.com. And again, it takes just a few seconds to log in. And once you're logged in, you're able to participate, respond, build ideas, comment, go back and forth, vote on ideas that you love, and build this conversation beyond what happens today in this room. We're going to leave this site up for about a month. So you'll see that we'll be adding content over the next few weeks, adding more questions and more opportunities for you to participate. So please sign in today, add your comments as you go, and we'll collect them there. That's a great way to collect it, I think. And then back there. So what I'd like for each of you to do is to read through the principles, get familiar with each of the 10, and I'd like for each of you to reflect on one of the principles that you really identify with, one that just ignites a true interest and passion in you, something that really resonates closely with who you are and what you do. So we'll spend 3 minutes and 30 seconds on that. And again, you can write it on the paper at your table or onto MindMixer. So we're gonna. So thank you for that first part. And for the second question here, that I'd like for you to think about is what's missing. These principles were written in 2005. So think about where the state of sustainability was in 2005, so many years ago, and think about things like the conversation around resiliency that has emerged really from that moment, and think now about what might come in the next 10 years. And so what in those principles is missing? Is there something that doesn't go far enough or could be changed or modified, added to make it more powerful and last deeper into the future now? So we'll do another couple minutes on that. All right, so let's wrap up the personal reflection time. Thank you very much for capturing your thoughts there. And now at each of your tables, please share with each other what you're finding from this. And I would like, there are pieces of paper at each table. There's a blue one and a green one. For this, if we could have one person at each table take the blue piece of paper and just take some notes as you go through. Unless you use the blue piece of paper, I've got more. and just share with each other for the next 5 minutes about what your observations were there. So anybody want to share some of what you found? What was discussed? Sure. Elise? Here.
Talk about it, Bob or someone else, of how they had educated the people in the Bancroft School, I think, the local people, and that there were jobs to come out of it. It would be nice if that was one of the principles, to try to educate local people. And then another one was emergency preparedness for all ages, like once a year or something, since it's a transient, people are moving in and out, and so there is a plan for the future.
Thank you. Others? Anybody? Share back here. Oh, come on the way there.
I have a good voice too, so and I raised my hand
Here,
immediately.
we'll come back.
I thought you were going late.
That's all right. I was coming on my way to you.
I have a big pushing voice. I raised my hand because we had the same ideas, this issue of emergency preparedness, and I'm from the Midwest too, so I don't know if they still do tornado drills in the schools, fire drills. There should be disaster drills that are relevant to the community, and I don't think we still have any of that in New Orleans, which is pretty sad. And this issue of communication, which when these principles were created, we didn't really have apps, or not many of them. And pretty much everybody, and having worked in low-income communities, deep dive for the last few years, you may not, lower-income folks may not have computers, but they're going to have apps. So using the existing infrastructure, like here, the local utility will push you a notice if your power goes out and tell you when it's coming back on. It wouldn't be that expensive to use existing communications infrastructure like that to push out information about emergencies.
Excellent. Back to you.
Items that we had as far as discussion, and it was great because we have a couple of local people who are here at the table with us too. And restoring the natural protection systems that are here. It's been a long time issue in the New Orleans area, and one that has been a constant topic of discussion. But making sure that that is taken and also honored. And it's been a long topic of debate, but one that needs to continue to have action to it. As we discussed some of the others, we had the integration and the thought of the 26 different ecosystems that we have here, and the melding between the two and integration between the two, and some great examples that we had with that. Obviously, one when French horns meet African drums, jazz was born. I think that was a great thought and great idea that we had up there. So. Redevelopment with the schools as the epicenter, how important that was, and using that as a staple in the community, and then growing from that point. To honor the traditions and styles as it's rebuilt, not to then bring in what we believe it should be, but actually taking the traditions, styles that are here in New Orleans and building to those and using those as our points of development. And passive survivability, how important that is, and as we become more and more dependent on technology, but to make sure that we can have that independence also and prepared for these things in the future. One item that we thought also may have been missing then was not to just afford the residents the ability to come back to a neighborhood, but looking to have them engaged and part of that redevelopment so they honor and respect and protect that neighborhood from that point going forward, and not just being someone moving back in, but being a true stakeholder in the rebuilding and redevelopment of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Again, we don't have time to get to everybody, but we do have the forum for everybody to participate, so please post any ideas that we missed or anything else that you want to share onto the MindMixer site, and we're going to start with Ryan here. So Ryan and Tom are both going to talk about their experiences running organizations with very different facets in New Orleans, building on the inspiration from the New Orleans principles.
So thank you for being here. My name is Ryan Evans, and what we're going to talk about in this next step of this workshop is how Tom's organization and our organization have worked to take the New Orleans principles and try to put those into practice. So I'm sure we can share with our failures that have been along the way as well as our successes, but we've really tried to learn about how we're going to take those New Orleans principles and actually get them boots on the ground. So skip forward here. The organization that I represent is Historic Green, along with Jeremy and two others. We came down here in 2007, not really looking to form an organization at all, but we had an invite to come down. We were amazed by what we saw when we visited the Lower Ninth Ward with people like Charles Allen, and it just didn't look right. It was America. We didn't think that America could look like that a full 2 years after the storm. And yet here it was, all this strife and destruction, and we felt like we needed to do something about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did and how we got to where we are today and where we're going tomorrow as well. And maybe in some way that can help inform what might become the next iteration of the principles and help expand that past New Orleans itself. So our mission is up on here behind me. It's kind of in 3 parts. One is to assist and lead. It's kind of weird to put assist before lead, but we felt like that was really important because we weren't down here to help lay the plans and tell people this is exactly how you should rebuild. We were here to listen first and to respond to the really great plans that had already been made by people like Bob Berkebile, who is the nationally recognized leader, and the local leader in Charles Allen, and what they were doing and stuff. We really didn't need to come in and do any of that. That was already done. They already had things like the principles and those other documents on sustainable recovery. They had adopted the climate goals that we were responding to. So when we got down here, we started working with the historic neighborhoods. So it was important that we also maintain a sense of place and of culture, as well as help them towards their really aggressive climate goals of carbon neutrality by 2020 and climate neutrality by 2030. Again, adopted those goals in those early charrette planning processes. And we do that through the tenets of cultural heritage conservation, i.e. preservation, and through sustainable design. And if that sounds familiar at all to you, it should, because like Bob had presented earlier, that we have this national movement that came out of passive survivability, became this movement of resiliency. We also have this movement now that's really based around, let's also take a look at the social aspects of place, and place matters, along with the economic and environmental aspects, and really do a good job with the triple bottom line. I think USGBC has done a great job with the environmental pieces, and even somewhat with the economic pieces of the triple bottom line. But I heard a presentation this morning by a speaker who was criticizing that we weren't doing enough socially, and that we needed to do more. And I think this is a way. It's not the way, but it certainly is a way that we can do a little bit more with the social aspects and really hit that sweet spot between those 3, people, prosperity, and planet. So as we look to honor the past and build for a future, Historic Green is a vehicle or a mechanism to be able to do that. But what the principles did not tell us was how to do it. So the principles did a good job of explaining why and what for, but it didn't really tell us how. So we had to take some time and really dig into that. And it didn't happen overnight. We had to spend about 3 years kind of perfecting our model here in New Orleans. And what we came up with was this list that's up on the screen of 7 different values. And of those 7 different values, the first 3 are really focused on the social side of that. Whereas the next 4 are kind of like how we actually go about doing our business. So you'll see things like deep partnerships and empowerment. And if you read empowerment, it's all about engaging youth. Because we knew that in any great movement in history, it was done by engaging the youth. So we figured we could do that again, and we could repeat that here. The youth came flooding into New Orleans after Katrina. They were coming here without jobs. They were coming here because they wanted to be a part of something that was bigger than themselves. What they needed was a way to engage, and they also needed the support of senior professionals, preservationists, sustainable design experts, on and on, who could work with them to teach them that. So the technical expertise and excellence and the participatory inclusive education were ways to do that. So the principles, for example, we were reading through it at our table earlier, they don't really speak explicitly about education, but we know that that's important. So what types of education are out there? Bob had talked about these after-school programs early on. We need to be doing something in these distressed neighborhoods to do education. So if we were to summarize those values, essentially what we're doing is really trying to reach out and work with good partners and volunteers in these distressed communities, and to be able to do things like weatherization, service learning, training opportunities. But it also goes beyond buildings. I think it's important to mention, and you'll see some examples of this momentarily, but that it really isn't just about the buildings themselves, but it's about the entire fabric of that community, of that neighborhood, which includes green spaces. It also includes maybe less tangible community aspects as well. And how we got started, if you look at our history, was Jeremy and I were both on the national committee several years ago for Emerging Green Builders at the time. It's now called Emerging Professionals. It was a collection at the time of students and young professionals. And we had gone to New Orleans, and we felt like we had an opportunity to do something as young professionals that could help. And so the first thing we did, and we were pretty proud of, was that we put a webcast together in Kansas City that was viewed by about 10,000 people online. It was simulcast to Tulane. All right, and then there was a live audience in Kansas City at Sprint's campus. And both Bob Berkebile and Charles Allen had come to Kansas City to present that with another friend, Dave McCauley. And we got done with it, and we thought, okay, we did a great job of getting the word out. Now what? Like, it doesn't feel like we've done enough. So we came back to New Orleans at that point, and we had started talking to the neighbors, and we said, okay, how can we really help you? And they had used the phrase, well, we feel like we've been shredded to death, which was humorous coming from a layperson that they would even know what a charrette was. But, you know, Bob, you were so effective at doing workforce training that you made them all planners and architects. Yeah. So we said, well, we said, well, what can we do to help? And they said, well, what we really need is somebody to help us. And we felt like, well, we're young. We can bring the brawn. We don't know what we're doing, but we can address that with the senior professionals. So we started on planning this alternative spring break. It was just a program of USGBC early on. It didn't have the right legal and insurance implications for USGBC, who was struggling at the time, frankly, to try to figure out what their social equity agenda was. So we spun it off as its own nonprofit, Historic Green. And we're really designed to work in the network of the chapters. So we've got, early on, Louisiana chapter, especially here in its representation in New Orleans, like they weren't able to function like other chapters because they were dealing with this natural disaster, which was also man-made, as Bob talked about earlier. But Central Plains, that's Kansas and the western part of Missouri, so Kansas City and Wichita are in that, but we work very closely with that group. That's home for a couple of the founders. We even put a memorandum of understanding, and we're planning some project work with Minnesota, which then, due to logistical reasons, actually fell through. But we're always looking for an opportunity to piggyback on the USGBC network to actually roll out some of these projects working in these communities. I think it's good to kind of get a lay of the land. So if you're here downtown, Central Business District, and kind of go around the river, through the French Quarter, and keep moving on through the upper Ninth Ward. Eventually what will happen here is you'll cross the Industrial Canal. So this is the lower Ninth Ward. You can see up here. I'm using my laser pointer, but right here. And it's bound by the Mississippi River and the Industrial Canal. And to the very top here is the Bayou Bienvenue. And then on this side over here, which is the very edge of Orleans Parish and New Orleans proper, is the Jackson Barracks, which I believe is the oldest continuously operating military installation in the U.S., 1830s, thereabouts. And the Holy Cross neighborhood, which is the historic neighborhood that was developed first, is the southern third of the lower Ninth Ward. It was around 5,600 people prior to Katrina. Charles, maybe you have a better number, but I want to say maybe 2,000 to 2,400.
2,500 maybe.
2,500 have come back, so not even half are back, even today. It's very diverse, mixed income. Most of the homes are on the national or local registries. So this was an important piece, is that we can't just go back and tear stuff down and rebuild it. That wouldn't even be the most sustainable thing to do. And it's certainly, from a cultural standpoint, it would be completely inappropriate. So, we look at structures there, like you see these Dulles steamboat houses. And these houses were actually built before there were levees. And so they were all tile and plaster on the first floor. So when the Mississippi River flooded, they would move their furnishings upstairs, wait till the waters receded, and then they would come down and just sweep everything out and bring the furnishings back down from the upper stories. So these beautiful homes were designed for passive survivability And now we build homes differently because we think we're protected by these man-made levees, and as we found out, that really wasn't the case. Just looking back here at Holy Cross again, too, I think it's important up here just to help you understand, Make It Right, which Tom is going to talk about. This was ground zero. So the levees collapsed in a couple of places here. The barge and the waters came in, knocked the houses off their foundations. That's why you don't see any density in this area up here. But then down here, where you got 20 feet of water up in here, it's a little bit higher ground down here, so maybe closer to the river, 4 feet of water, towards St. Claude Avenue right here, this first line in red, 8 feet of water approximately. So the houses were flooded, but they weren't destroyed. So that gave us an opportunity to go back in and work on the existing homes, that existing fabric in the neighborhood.
Looks like, sorry to interrupt, Brian, but I think what the slide is showing is structures that were deemed less than 50% damaged and not demolished by the Corps, right? Mm-hmm. So you can see the area that's sort of cleared out right where we're building.
Okay.
That's why there's no structures
density there,
Very
because there would be actually structures there in reality.
Right.
Okay. It is also true, though, Tom, isn't it, that a lot of those houses in your area there were completely destroyed, though,
right.
knocked off their foundation.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, one more quick thing here. The Greenbuild Legacy Project this year is this little 4-point star right here. So we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. I think it's also worth mentioning right here, this little green box down here at the bottom. That's the Global Green Project that Bob showed some slides of earlier. So a really important initial step in rebuilding in New Orleans, which informed a lot of the work that both Historic Green and, frankly, Make It Right had done as well. So here's a picture of Bill DuPont. Bill was the National Trust architect for 11 years, and then he now works as a professor in the Preservation School at University of Texas San Antonio. And what you see in this picture here is his students walking a ladder down the street. And just to be really brief, Bill was one of the ones for me personally that really helped me marry the concepts of preservation and sustainability. They weren't two things that looked good together. They were actually the same thing. And we discovered that in a conversation one time where I was pointing out that I felt like preservation was more about the buildings and sustainability was more about the people. And he said, well, no, it's the other way around. And I said, well, how do you mean? And he said, well, I just thought sustainability is more about technology and things like that. And then I realized, hey, we're really talking about the same things. They should be, not only should they be together, but they are the same. And our volunteers have worked a lot to help the neighbors in this community rebuild their homes. And so you can see they're just doing some simple things like painting here, and I've got some more slides coming up, which I'll share with you. But this gentleman here, I mean, most of the neighbors were dealing with a lot of post-trauma, lots of stress. Yes, sir, real quick.
Is this area of the Ninth Ward, is this the area of the Holy Cross area, because those houses were still intact?
Yes. So the question was, is this the Holy Cross area? Yes, this is in the Holy Cross area. Right here. So this is the one that would have gotten 4 to 8 feet of water here. So the types of activities that they're doing is something like deconstructing the homes that were no longer deemed to be rebuilt, gardens, and using swales to protect the storm sewers, using the historic wood, the old growth lumber, which is more appropriate to use from those deconstruction projects in the rebuilding. Doing some turnkey projects for some of the FEMA trailers early on. We also were restoring windows. A lot of this is the Delaware Street Playground, installing radiant barrier. There were lots of lessons on lead safety, asbestos safety, things like that. And sometimes we even did some lectures to help provide some context. Here's an example of a bell that we restored. And in this neighborhood, and I think it's really special what the neighborhood did afterwards, is they actually, when we gifted this project back over to them, they said, now every time a family comes home, we are going to ring this bell to announce to the rest of the neighborhood that somebody has come back to us. So that's a social aspect that we're particularly proud of. And that work has also come up to Kansas City, where we're doing the whole house renovations. And you can see here is a project that we had in Kansas City that where we built a community garden. And put it through the technical review, and there's about $150,000 community garden. All right, there was a video here that we're going to skip past and save time for more workshop, but I did want to just say that if you are still here on Saturday at 5227 Charters in the Lower Ninth Ward, this is the Greenbuild Legacy Project. From 9 to 2 on Saturday, we invite you all to come down. We're going to roll up our sleeves and try to do a little bit of work on this project. Again, this is the historic project, Creole Cottage, that we're really greening up, and it will become the home for the Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development.
And you can give lead specific hours for working on this project.
All right. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time than I planned just on the front end of this presentation, at the risk of cutting off some of our latest work and some of the ultimate outcomes of what we've been able to achieve. And so if you want to learn more about that, if that happens, if I run out of time and end up cutting some of that off, we actually have a booth on the expo hall floor. It's hard to miss. It's a recycled hot pink fabric canopy from the pink houses all the way sort of towards the back of the hall. So feel free to stop by our booth and learn more about some of the newer projects that we're working on. I think what's important, I'm not going to show a lot of devastation images, but this was from 2006, right? So it's about a year after the storm. And a lot of the lower Ninth Ward was still looked like this. And the question was whether or not it would ever recover. But one thing that we learned pretty quickly was that families were determined to come back. And they were living in FEMA trailers or building whatever they could afford, which certainly were not sustainable structures. And so some of Brad's motivation in working with Bob and Global Green was to help families who wanted to come back and rebuild in a way that was resilient and sustainable for the long term. And so I was part of a group of volunteers that signed up to do a feasibility study, really look at the condition of the infrastructure, where were residents located on blocks, what was the density, to try to figure out how we could implement Brad's vision for resilient, sustainable housing on a larger scale in New Orleans. And we started, I can't tell you the importance of both the New Orleans principles and the sustainable restoration plan that's developed from those to the work that we did, and that the groundwork had already been laid. So similar to what Ryan was saying about not needing to do that sort of planning work, that work had obviously already been done, and people were all planned out, and that was very clear in a series of meetings that we held with community leaders and residents and really anybody that we could find at the time to get their feedback. It was we're done planning. It's time to get something done. So unless you're going to get something done, and I remember this, Charles, you probably remember this meeting. I mean, like that message was very, very clear. And Brad said, well, look, before we do anything, we're here to listen. And Ryan mentioned that as well. I thought that in terms of implementing these, a project as a result of these principles, that listening step is really key. You've got to make sure that the community's voice is heard, but then sort of present in partnership throughout. So we spent 6 months listening before we put pen to paper, and then another 6 months designing, hand in hand with residents through a series of charrettes, so that partnership, which we actually formalized in an MOU with this group of neighborhood stakeholders, that partnership would continue throughout. So this is Brad's passionate about architecture. So he always says if he weren't an actor, he would want to be an architect. And so an idea that he had was to invite some of the best minds in architecture from all over the world and local groups as well. We've got about 1/3 local firms, 1/3 national firms, and another 1/3 international firms. Sort of convene these groups, invite them to listen to residents from the lower Ninth, hear about their needs, and work for free to design houses. So I'll give you just a little bit more. I could talk for hours just about this one slide. This is an aerial from when we started building, right before we started building in 2008. You'll see the levee. That's great. the levee. The levee in the background here, and then you can see we talked about sort of the lack of density because of this levee breach wiped out all these houses in this area, and we worked really closely with the community to select this location. And that was a lot of what we were doing in the 6 months leading up to the design work, sort of planning where we were gonna build. And we decided as a community to build in the worst hit area, right? And the idea was to really make a statement in doing that, and that if we could figure out how to rebuild the right way in the worst hit area, there's really no excuse for building any other way anywhere else. And so that was very intentional. This is an image, I wish I had it from the same angle, but this is an image of what it looks like today. This picture is about a week old. And this is the levee here, so it's taken from the other angle, but noticeable difference in the density. This is about 130 homes in this area total. We built about 100 of those. They're all LEED Platinum. You can see the sort of the colorful houses and the solar panels. We launched in December of 2007 with the pink houses, which was really an incredibly bold statement, and it was a gutsy move because at this point we had designs. So we invited 13 at the time architects. We've now got 21 volunteer firms to contribute designs and work with the community to develop those designs. And some of the prototypes were done, but this was in December of 2007. I knew I had to get houses built pretty shortly thereafter because, again, what we heard from the community was that they wanted action. And I had no idea at this point how we were going to build these houses. So we didn't have builders. We didn't have full sets of prints. But in working with the community, we kept this. I mean, planned this for 5 months, 6 months,
right.
And word never leaked. Okay, which is unbelievable. I mean, Brad Pitt was in the neighborhood in Charrettes on a monthly basis, working with the community. We were there, of course, every week to build out the concept for this statement, which was that this area remains devastated. Right, like this has been again a year and a half after the storm. We can't forget this neighborhood, and in doing that, the sort of the challenge to people was we can rebuild this community, and then once we did that, we had to. Right, it was like there was no turning back, and that's important, I think, for the ultimate outcome. It's like that you've got that motivation, that determination is critical. So we have a team of social workers, homeownership counselors that work with families to assess their needs and what they can afford. And we ask families to contribute as much as they can afford towards the cost of the home. And then we raise money. Our foundation contributes the gap financing, typically in the form of a forgivable loan. These are just an example of some of the houses that we've built, some of the architects. Billis is the first one, is local. Constructs, a firm from Africa. That's Frank Gary's duplex house, the pink house. Kieran Timberlake in the background and Concordia in the background. Another shot, Hitoshi Abe, Graft. The one in the middle, Brad helped design that house. David Ajay from London. This is probably one of the more innovative houses that we built. This one was the first floating foundation permitted in the U.S. So this house is designed to float in the event of a future storm. So it's built like a barge. 2 steel masts hold it in place. It's got telescoping and breakaway utility connections. And we also thought a lot about adaptability, durability, resiliency. So all the homes incorporate a variety of features to make them storm resistant. This is just one clear example. You can see this on the Greenville Living Home on the expo floor that's coming to our site for its permanent installation after the show. But this is called hurricane fabric, and it's just easier to apply than, say, nailing up plywood. It's made of Kevlar. It'll stop a 2x4 at 130 miles an hour. We based our design on McDonough's cradle-to-cradle design principles. And Brad read this book and changed the way that he viewed the world. And just in a nutshell, and Bill would probably kill me for trying to summarize this, but so the concept is that everything that we design or we build can or should be built or made to have a positive impact on people, on the environment, and on the economy. And so for us, how did we implement that into these houses? First we started by addressing the sort of designing for the needs of the residents and how they wanted to live and interact in the house. We of course, try to produce as much energy as we can. A lot of our houses are energy net zero, so they're contributing more electricity than they're using. But they're all designed for that, so a lot of it just depends on how the family operates. But regardless, significant energy savings. We try to collect and recycle as much stormwater as we can on site. We also assess all the materials that we use according to Bill's Cradle to Cradle product standards. And so some of the products that we use is recycled glass countertop, all low-flow fixtures, Energy Star appliances and lighting, no VOC, no formaldehyde cabinets, no VOC paint, Benjamin Moore, Shaw flooring. A lot of natural lighting, so we spend, going back to those historic New Orleans design principles, like covered porches, shading, cross ventilation, try to incorporate all those passive energy saving features as well. All the homes are certified LEED Platinum. This is my energy bill. I lived in a similar size home to the ones that we're building, about a 1,200 square foot conventionally built house. This is one of our energy bills for one of our residents over the same period of time. So if you think about the impact that can have on the budget of a working family, right? Like that's money for fresh food, the groceries, for after-school programs for their kids. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we did that from a building perspective, and especially integrating new technologies, new building technologies into our homes. So the challenge for us was to build a home that was impeccably designed, that was as green as it could be, and that was adapted for its environment, and that was affordable, right? And so the way that we tackled the affordability part was we started by building the best house that we possibly could build. And then we looked for ways to improve the system as a whole, sort of the efficiency of the system, the building as a whole, through a value engineering process, but where we refused to compromise, or at least that was the objective on some of the design features. So that incorporated things like advanced framing, new foundation designs, and we had to work with the building department to get these approved. And the way that the simple answer for how we did that was through persistence and determination. I mean, so Calvin Coolidge said that persistence and determination are alone omnipotent. And I think that the only other thing I would add to that is in science. So we worked with the University of New Orleans Building Science Laboratory and hydraulically pressure-tested wall systems that use 30% less lumber to prove that they would withstand the loads that they needed to withstand. We did a similar exercise related to pervious concrete. But that's how we proved the concept to get the approvals that we needed. And we're able to, through reducing quantity of materials and energy efficiency of installation, reduce costs. We choose to incorporate some really cool design features, like this is Trey Trahan's very unique roof. And it costs more to do that, but we think it's worth it. Sort of making an investment in the pride of the community. And I can tell you that all these residents love these houses. They choose their design. Everyone thinks that their design is the best. This is Miss Fletcher, Miss Parfait, Miss Leggett, just some sort of examples of what that means to sort of embrace the beautiful design. And then we also worked beyond the scale of the individual home, the scale of the city streets. So the idea was we'd done a good job of designing lots that retained up to a 10-year storm event with no runoff. But we thought about, well, what about other vacant lots around us, and can we retain even more water in the streets themselves? We did pervious concrete sidewalks and driveways on the lots, and we thought, well, could we do that at the street scale? And so we actually had to again go back to the University of New Orleans, hydraulically pressure test different mixtures of pervious concrete combined with a reinforcement technology that we found that doesn't rust. And as a result, we were able to work with the city to install some pretty innovative streets as a pilot in the area that we're building these houses. So if you get a chance to go, you'll see the streets are actually pervious. And of course, in addition to the infrastructure, we think about that community infrastructure as well. And so we try to focus on the community beyond housing. The house in the expo hall is going in right across the street from this playground. And it really is starting to feel a lot like a neighborhood again. We've got about 130 houses in the area that we targeted. I could go on for days about the land planning and how you create some density when you don't control the property. But I don't want to go too much over time. I want to spend more time in the workshops. We've gone, of course, outside of New Orleans now. We were asked by the city of Newark to help with a multifamily building for disabled veterans there. We opened it on Memorial Day 2012. We worked with Bob, of course, on the Bancroft site, which you heard a little bit more about. And I think the key point that I wanted to make related to that project was, again, the community-based planning process. So what happened here as a result of Katrina with the New Orleans Principles development and the subsequent planning efforts can be done without a natural disaster, right? Like that community-engaged design process doesn't take a natural disaster to implement. And so this is the Bancroft School today. Bob, your slides didn't quite get to this, so I'll show these images. And I'll end with that. Thanks.
All right. Well, that's just such a great story of what has come from that. And I think both Ryan and Tom talked about how the lessons and the work that's been done in New Orleans has now gone on to other communities in other parts of the country and has the potential to go further than that even. And so I'd like to start this next workshop with a question. And you can work individually, but I think we ought to just dive into conversation on this one. Again, if we can have somebody take some notes at the table, I'd appreciate it so that we can capture some of what's being said at the end here. And really the question here is look back at that principle that you personally identified with in the first round and reflect on how you, when you go home from here, when you leave this place, can take that home, can take it to your workplace, to your family, to your city. How can you put that principle into action in a daily way that brings that into reality wherever you're from? So let's get started. Thanks.
So sorry to interrupt. I always hate this part because you're all really going great, and now we have one more question. So let's wrap what you were doing. We do keep making your notes, and we do hope to get this collected and make sense out of it so it'll be available to all of you afterwards and others that weren't here. So the last question, as I mentioned at the time I was speaking, is, in spite of this collective great work you've all done, as we look at the science, at this point about 97.8% of all the large pattern scientists say global climate change is A, real, B, developed by humankind, and C, the greatest threat humankind has ever faced. And lots of others are weighing in now, like Hank Paulson, our former Secretary of the Treasury, saying this is a bigger threat to our economy than the credit meltdown was. So if that's the case, I think it's pretty clear that it is, how do we, at this point, respond to this moment and do something that really is brilliant and transformative and moves a lot faster than we have in the last decade? So in a way, how do we not only now we've arguably changed the industry, how do we change ourselves and our culture and light a fire that creates dramatic change immediately? So that's your last question. The simple one.
Okay, I want to honor the time that we have here. So we have about 10 minutes left. There's rehearsal sessions here at 4:30, so we have a little bit of time to go over, but not a lot. I'd like to ask for some report outs, some of what you've been talking about to share with everybody here. Heather back here is going to be capturing what as we go. And then I'm going to ask our panelists to each offer about a 1-minute closing comment. So would anybody like to share sort of something about your conversation, what you're inspired by here? Anybody? Want to jump in?
We we were talking a little bit more about the principle number 7 about honoring the past and building for the future. And I guess personal takeaway for me is I was comparing the approach that has happened here in New Orleans versus the urban renewal of the 50s and 60s. And I'm from Boston, and we still have the scars of tearing down the West End and replacing it with modern buildings with basically no participation of the residents. And so, I think the lesson that I take from this is if you want it to work, it's got to be inclusive. It's got to have all those people involved. It's not something that you're going to impose from outside. It's ultimately something that the people who live there want to have happen. And so if we extend that to solving issues like climate change, again, it's ultimately not about somebody mandating you've got to do something. It's about helping people see that it's to their benefit to do something about it.
Others? Amelia?
I just want to reiterate, we sat down and I said right at the beginning, reading through the principles, this applies everywhere and we should not wait until a disaster strikes. So just to really reiterate that if we're all really planning on restricting ourselves or really preparing ourselves for any future disasters that are coming, then we won't have to, we'll have less to do in the hindsight. So then we were just talking about how overwhelming the thought of, applying this everywhere is. How do you reach everybody? So I was just saying it would be a very interesting study to figure out, if I went to my neighborhood council and I worked with that one neighborhood, how long would it take to really get change to happen in their specific plans or in their planning documents? And then how many neighborhoods are there in, I don't know, let's say the United States, that then, how many people would it take, how many times to go meet with how many people engaged to really start this critical change? I'm not saying that I'm going to do this study, but, I think it's an interesting idea. It's the idea of bringing this down to a scale that doesn't freak us out so much, that says, yeah, but I don't know if I can really be the ultimate change, but how could we break this down so that each person can say, but I could do this? And it's a quantifiable, this is how many times typically you would have to go meet to really effectively have these principles embedded in every single community that's out there planning and building, hopefully responsibly.
Thanks.
So just to touch on what you were just saying, I'm here from New York. After Sandy, I have friends who work for the New York City, and they were deeply involved with the restoration centers for people to come when they had nowhere to go. And they worked in conjunction with people from New Orleans, including the deputy mayor, FEMA, to figure out how to handle that situation. Because New York had no documents or plan in place to handle anything like that. They're not, that's not, those things don't happen there. So there was this collaboration of sorts where, they received help from people here. Now, on the other end, I wanted to talk about the thing we were saying earlier about educating the children so we could think forward. And years ago, I relocated here after Katrina to help rebuild schools. And one of the issues that I found is it took years for the money to get where it needed to be and things to happen and for these schools to get rebuilt. So I worked on one in 2008 and it just got finally opened last year. Okay? That type of thing would never happen in New York. And it's very frustrating and to see.
It would never take that long.
I'm sorry?
As in it would never take that long.
No. So what we were talking about here, or I guess what I was complaining about, is that if you don't have the facilities to teach the kids, and you don't have the money to have the teachers to teach the kids, and now these schools are overpopulated with children because there's less schools, you're not going to get the quality education you need to bring them along. So how do we handle that?
I'd like to offer a chance for each of our panelists to give about a 1-minute final thought And then we will have a little bit of time afterwards. That will be the end of our session, but if you'd like to stick around, I think we can spend a little bit more time sharing among ourselves here. Tom, you want to start us out?
Sure. So one consistent theme that I heard throughout was how do we share what's been done already, what's been learned already effectively, and another theme I heard was technology, which is baked into the principles. But does that even bear sort of calling out as an intention if we're talking about sort of updating the principles? But the intentional use or intensive use of technology to both further engagement, right, and sort of making use of whatever that latest technology is very purposefully, very intentionally as part of this planning process. And in terms of sharing what's worked and what hasn't, we can do that to a certain extent right now. And we come to conferences like Greenbuild and have these conversations, but is there a way to engage with a broader audience, right? Almost like in sort of a crowdsourcing way. And in some ways that can be done today online. So like, even on our website, for example, we're happy to have these conversations and sort of share what's worked and what hasn't worked for us as you take this back to your communities, even at a very technical level, right? You've got a question about elevated foundations in Iowa, right? Like we can show you at least what we've done here. Maybe it helps, and that way we're not reinventing the wheel so much every time a disaster hits or related to preparing before one does.
Yeah, building off of what Tom said, it's a matter of scale now, right? Because we have these lessons that we applied here in New Orleans. We've started to take them other places. Some of them will apply directly. Some of them will need to be adapted. But that's one of the things I'm hearing. And I think technology helps us scale. But it also can take away from the human element of us sitting across the table from each other. So we have to be very careful about how we use technology and that it doesn't hinder us from actually having the conversation. And then the other one that really stuck out for me, probably more than anything, was education, which I actually believe is implicitly embedded into the principles as they stand today, but probably needs to be explicitly added to the principles. And that goes, all the way from the oldest to the youngest, but primarily with that youth engagement. We were hearing a lot about that. It kind of embedded in some of the conversations with you all, and then also in our presentations, that's something we've stumbled upon, that we know that the youth as it stands today are going to have the most impact, and so if they're going to have the most impact on what we're doing, we have to do a better job of providing them the tools, and one of those tools is education.
So to our friend from New York there, who was expressing your anxiety about space and resources and how you reach children, well, down here, and I'm sure you all are doing it up there, we've, of course, had to push the envelope in terms of being creative. So when I sort of graduated or left being active in the neighborhood association in my community, I became more active in my church because I thought there's less arguing going on in the church. Maybe not. Depends on the issue or the scripture out of the Bible or whatever. But anyhow, I've got a church pastor who, just like Pam DeShiel, is like, we need to do more with the children and the blah, blah, blah. And Charles, I heard that you used to teach in the local school system. Would you put something together for children in sharing and imparting these ideas around resilience and so forth? And so we do. We have what's called Family Hour every 6 to roughly 7 o'clock every Sunday evening. And we gather together adults on one side, children on the others, and we just do topical discussions of all kinds, Just trying to be creative, realizing we may not have a grant. It's not a grant-funded project to do this, but through our ministries, and with Charles being the director now of this program, we will do this, Creativity, man, that's all I can say.
Thanks, Charles. I want to build on this creativity idea. one of my professors was Bucky Fuller, and Bucky, we talked a lot about change, and he said a couple of things about change. One was the only way to make significant change is to make the thing you're trying to change obsolete. And I would argue we've made significant change in this industry, but we haven't made the old system obsolete yet. We have to be more brilliant, more efficient, more beautiful, and more resilient. And when we get there, we're close, but we need more affordable, absolutely. And so a lot of things are moving us in that direction, and this is the time, the year, the month for us to start making that leap. The other observation I would share is I think some of what's held us back is that we have had a tendency, the word religion was used a minute ago, to make this a religious thing, which can get to be kind of a righteous, off-putting conversation. You know, it's like, I am on the right side and you must be evil because you're consuming too much energy, releasing too much carbon. And we've had a tendency to get captured in that conversation in USGBC and in this whole movement. And I think this, as I see it, is the moment to shift that on its head entirely. I am not against any of those folks that we often criticize. I am for a future that is more beautiful and more resilient and more loving than the one we currently have. And we all know a lot of different ways to move in that direction. And now I think it's time to lock arms, use the technology, use creativity, and say we're doing it, and get with us. Thanks.
So that is our time. We've got a few more folks that raised their hands, so I'm going to pass the mic. If you need to go, this is fine to do that. And please don't let the conversation stop here. Again, we have the MindMixer site up, and we will be adding questions, and our panelists will be looking in and adding comments and responses to anything that we're posting up there. Thank you.